Following the work of Matthew Goldmark in the article National Drag, the Language of Inclusion in RuPaul's Drag Race, we'll be looking at the notions of queer liberalism and homonormativity, particularly in the way that it impacts RuPaul's Drag Race content wise, structurally, but also how it has impacted the larger LGBTQ community within a broader Western context. So, according to Goldmark, RuPaul's Drag Race links economic advancement and individualism with increased social capital for sexual minorities. So, we noticed that the show, as it's structured like a reality TV show, there is this promise of a cash reward at the end. Um, which is in many ways fitting, thinking about how much the contestants pay to go on the show, particularly in the past 5 years. But there's also a number of other economic incentives. And we also notice the language of capital, of money, of money making, of branding as related to the creation of a particular subjectivity of a drag performer. So a drag performer's future and future social capital, future success is predicated on this notion of economic advancement as well as a specific notion of individualism. So, thinking about the drag history that we've looked at, the notion of collective identities, the ways in which gay liberation movements and smaller drag subcultures historically have been very much based on collective support, even if there were structural differences around race, class, and gender. There was less of a sense of individualism because it wasn't necessarily possible within this dominant Western paradigm, wherein the ideal citizen in this context, we can still see how it's structured around a the archetype of a white upwardly mobile cisgender heterosexual man. So based on those kinds of axes of privilege, that slowly certain gay people, certain lesbian people, certain people within the broader LGBTQ paradigm are able to access that notion of citizenship and all the certain rights and advancements that it entails. So we can see how narratives and these kind of rituals on RuPaul's Drag Race really is situated within very much a capitalist framework and within this notion of individualism. And so that's where we get the notion of queer liberalism. So we're used to seeing the word liberal as, either referring to a political party in Canada or as to reflect kind of the assumed opposite of what a conservative would be. So that's often placed as this binary liberal versus conservative, wherein liberal refers to maybe having a set of political views that are maybe more open. Some might even call progressive, although that is a misnomer. So, in this context, we're referring to liberalism in terms of larger shifts in global capitalism, particularly within the context of the impact of the United States and Canada to the same extent as it's within this Western context. So these shifts in global capital that have, increased the availability of, media networks on an international stage, but also shifts in global capitalism where the notion of free enterprise is first and foremost. So in this context, queer liberalism, similar to homonormativity, refers to a certain individualism, this idea of inalienable rights, that access to liberty and free enterprise and capitalist advancement is kind of the ideal goal of being a modern citizen in Canada and the US and in other countries as well. But it's very clearly part of the capitalist structures in Canada and the US. And of course, just a refresher, so homonormativity, we can kind of counter it against heteronormativity. So heteronormativity concisely refers to the ways in which heterosexuality as a social structure, as a particular way of organizing society, of organizing social groups, is named as the norm, is situated as the norm, where in which homonormativity looks at how the ways that certain LGBTQ people, mostly gay and lesbian, have been able to access this position of modern citizenship that I was just referring to. So, what happens when certain members of an oppressed community are able to access those forms of privilege that they were once excluded from? There is this occurrence wherein certain norms are created. So again, that idea, that idealism of being able to access the market, being able to have disposable income, being able to travel, being able to afford living expenses and other forms of modern citizenship. So it creates this ideal within LGBTQ community as well. So this homo norm, which is structured upon these kinds of characteristics that I've been referring to. And so these notions really reflect single axes perspectives on social progress. We've looked at how analysis in different historical movements or in different theoretical perspectives that focus on one individual axis of experience. So, in this context, sexuality, measuring specifically sexuality to think about, how far gay people have come, but without the inclusion of thinking about the ways that sexuality is always already mediated and co-constituted through things like race, through things like gender, class, embodiment, and relevant for this particular unit, nationalism or nation. So where does someone's what's the concept of national belonging, and how do queer people then fit into it? For instance, an institution like marriage, an institution like the military. So this single axis perspective, where in which queerness is seen to have become mainstream, where different specific LGBTQ people are able to kind of be situated in a normative perspective. So um, we saw the image on the last slide of these, two white gay men behind a pink picket fence, kind of referring to the kind of archetype of 1950s heterosexual um, nuclear family, kind of taking gay men and then saying, well, this is the same kind of American dream that now certain people are able to access. So, by placing this idea that homophobia and queer oppression is in the past, which we know it is not, it does occur in different ways in different places. Um, but if you are only looking at specific queer experiences, and those are the ones that tend to be overrepresented in the media, it obscures the ways that there's wildly different ways that LGBTQ people experience their sexuality and gender in relationship to race, class, nation, and embodiment, as I mentioned. So to only think about the gay liberation movement, or in the mainstream context, it's probably more applicable to refer to it as gay pride, um, these kind of larger bodies of gay pride that organize larger pride parades that are these huge spectacles and are ostensibly welcome to anyone, including major corporations and police presence. And this brings us to thinking about the ways that US imperialism is reflected on and structured through RuPaul's Drag Race. So this while it's not necessarily explicitly referred to, we do know, of course, that the US has this long history of imperialism, in addition to being a colonial settler state. So, imperialism and imperialist control over different parts of the world, over different countries, over different islands or former countries that have been colonized, that have been annexed. That kind of history and that continual legacy isn't made explicit on Drag Race. And we do see, we might not be seeing everything. We don't know if there's more of a critique that's being kind of obscured. But for instance, the relationship between US imperialism and Puerto Rico, many people in Puerto Rico, are pushing back against US imperial rule on the island. But we don't see that critique. But at the same time, it's very likely that the queens who are from Puerto Rico are very aware of that kind of dynamic. So this brings us to think about how the US on Drag Race, um, and of course, this is to an extent other state based institutions such as the military, as I mentioned, how the US is positioned as safe, as this place of safety for the LGBT community. So has an effect of erasing both the current and historical forms of oppression perpetuated by and within the US. So it's this idea that now the site for an ideal queer life positioned within queer liberalism and homonormativity is the US. And this is very dangerous. Not only does it obscure the ways that the United States in different contexts, so within urban rural populations, um, within different communities, because obviously it's not a homogenized United States, is seen as the pinnacle of the safe LGBTQ life, the ideal community, the place where you will be able to access the most rights, the most visibility. So this not only is problematic for people living within the United States, but also negates the history of homophobia, of heteronormativity, of transphobia as perpetuated by the United States government, the colonial and imperialist kind of legacy of the United States. So we can think of a very prominent historical example of that kind of imperialist practice in another context. So while this isn't about the U.S., I think this idea still is very clear, where the British, when they had basically by colonial violent rule, um, kind of taken over India in this British Raj. Um, the laws against homosexuality that were put in place were put by the British government, not enshrined by the Indian government before it was annexed by the United States. And so when there have been discussions recently around homophobia and homophobic violence and transphobic violence as well in India, that history isn't talked about. However, often, England, the UK, parts of Western Europe, the United States, Canada are positioned as being the antithesis of those countries, where certain countries, particularly in the Middle East, are characterized by homophobia, and the place to become safe is the United States, is the UK, is Canada. So this isn't saying that some of these experiences within those contexts of homophobia are not very real, but if we're not thinking about the historical legacy of particular laws, of particular forms of homophobia and transphobia that have been in place by colonial and imperialist Western powers, we forget that this notion of safety is very much predicated on specific ideas of what the LGBTQ community is. And we see these kind of fictions of nationalism performed on reality TV in the context of Drag Race. So the contestant's body, Goldmark argues, serves as a metonym for the national body. Nationalist rhetoric is very much gendered in Canada and the US, and particularly in the US, where the notion of nation is very much gendered masculine and masculine within a heteronormative cisgender context. So the military is seen as this masculine extension of the U.S., of presence both within and and outside of the country. We can see elements of this during the Cold War. Rhetoric within the United States would often position the USSR, the Soviet government as feminine, as feminized, and this was one of the problems of the country. So structuring it as capitalism as a very masculine, dominant, and active form of politics. Whereas things like communism were characterized by certain figures in the United States government, within the media, as feminine and therefore as lesser. So on the show, if a particular performer's if a particular performer is being situated within this national myth, situated as a representative of America, as the best parts of America, of an America that is tolerant of gender diversity, then we see that drag performer's body being used as a form, as a part of that nationalist rhetoric.